Okay, listen. I know I've been missing for several weeks, but it's important, I swear. I have been watching, playing, reading, eating, breathing several hours straight of vampire content, and I am ready to dump this very crucial, very important information onto you.
You are too late. My blood now flows through your veins.
Good evening, monsters and mechanoids, and happy early Halloween. Today I'll be ranking these vampires in fiction on a tier list, going over what I liked and disliked about each, maybe what could have been a bit better with certain entries, and overall just finally getting the chance to talk for hours on end on how I'm very unhealthily obsessed with these guys. I mean, look at me. Look at my VTuber. Anyways, very briefly, I wanted to clarify before I start. This is a living tier list. There's so much vampire media I want to cover, and I just can't fit it into a single video lest it become a several-hour ordeal, and I'm just not that kind of YouTuber. This will be a series in multiple parts, and for future viewers, this will be part of a larger playlist. I feel like it's best to start this list with pieces of media that I find crucial to the establishment and history of the vampire mythos, and while this is not at all the first piece of vampire media to ever be written, we'll get to those soon, Dracula is arguably the most influential. There are so many adaptations of the story alone that it was honestly overwhelming, but naturally I decided to start with the original book, as it'd serve as a good foundation for what's to come. I have to say, in my opinion, the story was excellent and honestly deserved all of the hype of its time. It's not necessarily scary to me. I didn't expect it to be, but I honestly love the setup. I love the characters, how they were written, and how Dracula to me is honestly a well-written villain. And I mean, it's Count Dracula. He has to be. It was so interesting. At the beginning, he's proudly talking to Harker about his heritage and their achievements in battle, when in retrospect, the heritage in question is obviously just stuff that he did himself centuries ago. I thought that was a really nice touch, and it speaks to not only the worldview of this creature, nor his ego, of course, but his abilities to strategize, setting him up to be a formidable force to be working against. And this is done time and time again. He's well-spoken, charismatic, well-read, and his history shows that most of all, he's vindictive. That when he's defeated in the moment, he's guaranteed to return and try again. It makes the story feel less like a chase scene and more like a full-scale war at times. This guy doesn't just want food, he wants full-blown conquest. And even aside from the establishment of the villain in and of itself, the environment does a lot of favors for him as well. The beginning of the book sets up the existence of a very intimidating force, even before his full-on introduction, as Harker is traveling to Transylvania to meet with the Count, with the locals not only warning Harker to not go, but noticeably, as he does leave, solemnly crossing themselves. As for your other characters, there's honestly not any that I didn't like out of the main cast. My favorites being Dr. Seward, Dr. Van Helsing, Mina, and of course, Renfield. I'm not going to go on much longer with this book. I just want you to know now, when I discuss the adaptations of this book, that this book has a strong supporting cast, and you should keep this in mind, especially with the role of Renfield. They're obviously not vampires themselves by any means. I can't rank them, but the roles are used to up the intimidation factor of the vampire himself, very effectively so. All of this being said, I'm going to put the original book in the S tier. So next, of course, we have Dracula's many adaptations. The first adaptation I watched was one of the many Christopher Lee Dracula movies, the first one from 1958, The Horror of Dracula. They do change quite a bit around from the book, especially the supporting cast in and of itself. Renfield is unfortunately seemingly non-existent. People's spouses are reversed and renamed, and oddly, crucially, Harker comes into this situation well aware of what Dracula is, coming to not facilitate Dracula's move to London this time, but instead under the guise of organizing his library. Harker even dies early on. It's the rest of the supporting cast that carries the plot for this iteration. However, that doesn't mean that the film in and of itself is inherently bad by any means. The likely reasoning for these changes, in fact, were, in my opinion, likely influenced by a couple things. Firstly, by this point, many people probably knew and read the source material. There was another film even released prior to this one, starring different actors. So a retelling with a reworked plot would likely be new and exciting for many people. Secondly, I'd imagine that they were constrained to whatever was time period appropriate in the film industry. So, what are my thoughts? Despite the different plot, I have to say that I actually enjoyed it. It had very good shots. Noticeably, there's a lot of usage of green in this movie, very interesting choice, and it had to have been deliberate. Overall, good actors, especially and most obviously Christopher Lee for his role as Dracula. He definitely makes an intimidating count, in my opinion, and his supporting cast still amplifies that, even despite being written differently. My only criticism is that he becomes less intimidating due to there essentially being a chase scene around the end. I mean, they do chase Dracula in the book, I know, but this is different. In the book, it takes place in the mountains of Transylvania, the Carpathians, in rough weather, and they're struggling to figure out what route the Count is taking to his castle before it's too late. This spans multiple strenuous days and several wearily written diary entries. There is a lot at stake here. The chase scene in the movie, in contrast, is arguably more low stakes. It's not really a planned out struggle against a genius villain, but rather a playful and humorous chase scene with a couple of buddies against a silly monster. And while I still like that, it definitely makes the Count a bit less fearsome in the last few minutes. Still, as a vampire, Christopher Lee does an amazing job, and I still want to put him in the S tier. After watching this film, before watching the Lugosi 1931 adaptation, I wanted to first step back and watch Nosferatu. Now, it's a given that a lot of names are changed in this one, as it was an unauthorized adaptation of the book. As many of you know, because of this, Nosferatu almost became lost media over a lawsuit by Bram Stoker's family, which ended with an order for all copies to be destroyed. Fortunately, this obviously wasn't successful, and we're still able to watch it. I thought that this one was incredibly interesting. For its time and circumstances, I liked the shots of this one quite a bit. I feel as though these shots at times make Count Orlok, not Dracula, look honestly quite uncanny and very intimidating for 1922 silent film standards. The story was interesting enough. It's obviously not going to be an exact replica of the book, given what I said before. The only thing that I didn't really like too much is how the ending was done. On one hand, this was a milestone. It was the first time we saw in film a vampire being killed by sunlight. But the way that it's done just makes the Count look like an overall stupid, non-threatening villain. Basically, Ellen, I guess is the stand-in for Mina, deliberately sacrifices herself by letting Count Orlok in and letting him drink her blood. While he's doing this, he's apparently distracted by her beauty and lets himself disintegrate in the sunlight. While this concept is good in theory, it felt very anticlimactic to me. It doesn't help that in other parts of the story, the Count's successes are reliant on Hutta, I guess your stand-in for Harker, being cartoonishly stubborn against believing in anything unusual or supernatural until it's much too late. All in all, Count Orlok isn't exactly the most genius vampire ever, but he still looks pretty disturbing in just the right amount of darkness. I suppose he still had some level of evil strategy still, and I honestly love him. I mean, look at this funny little guy. So I'll put him in the B tier. Remember, we're not exactly ranking the media themselves nor their achievements, just the vampires in them, so please forgive me. So next, I watched the 1931 film with Bela Lugosi. By this point, it had felt like I had been peering into several alternate universes for the Dracula storyline. Things in each film adaptation I watched were changed drastically to give each respective film its own identity, and I learned that while yes, it's different, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad. It can still be great, in fact, and with the right plot ideas, you can still make for a very formidable vampire. But when I saw in the credits that these characters were casted by name, and it seemed like everyone was there, I was honestly excited. I wanted to see how this film would go about this. A lot was still different, in a very odd way too. Listen, I'm going to start off with what I disliked here, and then pivot to what I actually enjoyed about this film. You all know that my favorite non-vampire role in Dracula is Renfield. I feel that his role in the story sets up the vampire to be all the more of a threat, from his borderline incoherent babbling of the master, to him quite literally being beaten to death by Dracula in the original story when he's no longer of use to him. To me, if you're going to include Renfield as a major force in the story, you still have to utilize him correctly. He establishes the motivations, the cruelty, and the calculated nature of the Count. And I just don't feel like this film in particular really explores that potential with him, while also paradoxically paradoxically using him the most of all out of the adaptations. We don't start the film with Harker. For some reason, it's with Renfield. And he's not in the asylum just yet, and he's got new lore. He's the one that went overseas to visit the Count. This was an interesting choice, and I was genuinely wondering where they would go with this. Renfield gets put under the control of the Count, and it's in this process in which he becomes the Renfield that we know. Suspension of disbelief is a fickle thing, and while yes, Renfield does in fact eventually invite the vampire into the asylum like he's supposed to, I'm not sure why Dracula insisted on keeping this guy around. He already served the purpose of Harker at the beginning, a man who in the original story, Dracula basically ditched. Taking him on the boat was questionable. I know that this guy is a strategist, but how would he know that when people would search the boat to discover Renfield, the only apparent survivor of all the dead people on that ship would take him straight to the asylum instead of arresting him, even possibly killing him, or at the very least questioning him? The ship scenario works in the book because there are no witnesses left to even attempt to talk to, only journal entries that get more and more nonsensical. And the original Dracula strategy of finding someone who's already there in the asylum seems much like a safer bet to me. I'm not usually critical of deviations from the original, but this one was puzzling to me. The circumstances of Renfield's death are all the more confusing. In the book, Renfield dies after trying to kill Dracula upon the discovery that his master is basically tossing him aside like trash, completely ignoring him as he no longer serves a purpose in his plan. In this film, he's killed over a genuine misunderstanding when Renfield is intercepted by Harker and Mina on his way to Carfax Abbey. The Count thinks that Renfield deliberately led him to these two and thinks that he's been betrayed, which gives off the impression to me that this iteration of the Count is a bit more clumsy with his plans. This isn't the only thing that stumped me in terms of the plot. Another issue is that this Dracula really likes hypnotism instead of just biting people. I mean, sure, he still targets both Lucy and Mina, and to his credit, he's still successful with Lucy like in the book. But what I mean here is that there is a scene where he has an isolated Van Helsing very much in biting range and insists on hypnotizing him instead, only to fail that anyway. And he's just like, drat. Foiled again. I feel like book Dracula would have just never allowed this to happen. In fact, some of the scenes are direct hand-to-hand combat where they just cannot overpower this guy, and there's a very real chance that he's going to bite them and kill them. My final complaint is that yes, while in the book Harker is a bit clumsy, it's a character trait of his. He's not the most observant or strong by any means. I felt like this movie though just made him completely oblivious at times, which in turn makes it just seem like the Count just had it easy. If you noticed, all my criticisms of this movie are with its plot. The actor himself, Bela Lugosi, actually carries the role himself. He does make a great Count Dracula in terms of his acting alone, behaving very peculiarly, mysteriously, and doing just whatever he can to appear as this cold, manipulative monster. And admittedly, his castle at the beginning is pretty sick. He's still a decently threatening force at times, just not as much as he could have been. I have to say, overall, this Count is hindered by how he's written, making him very middle of the road to me. I know this will get a lot of people mad, but I'm putting this one in the C tier. Part of me wonders if I would have ranked this Count higher had I not read the book, but honestly, I don't think so. I know a lot of people enjoyed this movie and the Dracula in it, so please, I suggest you still watch it for yourselves and formulate your own opinions on it. If you still enjoy it, great. I still did to a degree. I definitely still liked it. I just don't think the Count is as compelling in this one. If I were ranking the movie in and of itself, I'd have it more so in the B tier. Now, here's one I've been very excited to cover. Carmilla. I feel like most people know about Carmilla at this point, but for those unfamiliar, it predates Bram Stoker's Dracula by about 25 years, written back in 1872. That's the main draw it has for people wanting to read more vampire literature. I know I picked it up a few years ago out of genuine curiosity to see how different vampire mythology was before Dracula was written, and lucky for us, it's not all too different. They mostly have the same weaknesses, the same behaviors, and the same things that will still kill them. However, another big draw to this book is that, like almost all vampire stories, there is an element of romance to this one, significantly so this time. This one, very interestingly, explores this vampire's feelings towards the main protagonist. It's very interesting to read something from 1872 that seems to have had a hand in kicking off all of our little vampire fanfictions many years later. I want to keep this summary as short as I can so that there's at least some proper context to my points. Much different from the plot of Dracula, Dracula, this story centers around a younger protagonist, a girl named Laura. The environment she lives in is already pretty lonely and intimidating, that being a vast castle in the forest in which she lives with her father. Similar to a lot of your vampire media, Dracula included, Laura has dreams of this woman slinking into her bedroom. In her dreams, she finds the classic bite marks on her body, but in reality, mysteriously, nothing seems to be there. Nobody in the castle really takes much note of this, but are supposedly more alert, and nothing else really happens for years. Still, at the same time, if I were her, I'd personally be incredibly freaked out and cautious for all those years to come, so already to me, we've established at least some danger. It is well established just how suffocating this environment is. Laura makes it very clear that she's lonely, reasonably so, and her wishes for company are soon granted. Oddly, almost too good to be true of a coincidence, a carriage crashes outside, and the honestly rather peculiar family inside leaves their daughter behind temporarily with Laura and her father. Laura and Carmilla recognize each other from that aforementioned dream at the beginning, and things would only become more puzzling and arguably more interesting as they continue to bond, with limits of course, as Carmilla oddly will not disclose certain things. You get your standard vampire stuff here. People randomly die in towns nearby, Carmilla not being a fan of any religious symbolism or prayer, odd sleeping habits, and more peculiar dreams. Laura also begins to mysteriously decline in health, all the while Carmilla is bonding with Laura when she's awake. I'm explaining all of this because there is a layer of tragedy to this one. While the two obviously enjoy each other's company to some degree, one's existence is only sustained by feeding on the other, and a lot of the symbolism in the story suggests that a good chunk of Carmilla's affection for Laura is based in lust. A lot of people debate to this day how much Carmilla actually loved Laura, and whether or not she had intentions to turn Laura into a vampire, but the point is all the same regardless. Their friendship in any relationship simply cannot be given the circumstances. This is solidified when Carmilla is finally exposed and killed before Laura's very eyes, an event that she is written to never truly get over. What I liked about the story and this antagonist specifically was that the story cranks the parasitic aspect of the vampire up to 11, that it's even more frightening to think about the ones you love and trust using you, feeding off you, and slowly killing you, all unbeknownst to you. Dracula, while a menace, swoops into windows and controls his food. He just gets close enough for you to let him in, and he feeds, but the story of Carmilla has an added pain to it in that she gets close to her victim. I can't say that one or the other is better here. Both apply to very different tactics. Both are very cunning, and both apply quite a bit of damage with their approaches in a believable and well thought out way. While her true feelings are a mystery to many, or maybe I'm just not the greatest at reading, I'd say that Carmilla from her original story belongs in the S tier. I haven't watched any direct adaptations of Carmilla yet, other than her appearance in Vampire Hunter D Bloodlust, but I fully intend to soon. Now, there is one story that predates both Dracula and Carmilla. This one is straightforwardly just named The Vampire, written all the way back in 1819 by John William Polidori. This was, interesting enough, apparently submitted to the same contest in which Mary Shelley's Frankenstein was submitted. The vampire antagonist in The Vampire goes by the name of Lord Ruthven, and to put it bluntly, this guy is an absolute menace. For context, the protagonist, Aubrey, meets Lord Ruthven at a party. They surprisingly hit it off very well, despite Ruthven already being a pretty odd guy. They actually end up traveling together. During their travels, however, Aubrey comes to realize that this man isn't just eccentric. This guy is an absolute sadist who actively mistreats the people around him, his preference for this specifically being women. Ruthven attempts to perform this same song and dance towards a woman that Aubrey himself knows. Aubrey, upon witnessing this, rightfully ditches this guy. He heads to Greece and finds himself smitten with a woman named Iantha. Let's be honest here. We all know what's going to happen to her. Iantha is attacked and killed with your typical wounds to the throat that a vampire would leave behind. There is also, however, a dagger found alongside the corpse. This is obviously important later and really gives us insight into how Ruthven really is as a character. Aubrey, very obviously shocked at this occurrence, falls ill. Who does he end up being under the care of? Take a guess. Yep, it's Lord Ruthven again. At first glance when I read this, I honestly thought that maybe Lord Ruthven straight up hypnotized him or something, but no. While Aubrey was in fact skeptical, this was Lord Ruthven successfully manipulating this guy yet again. So they're traveling together once more. Everything seems to be going alright until suddenly they're both ambushed by bandits who injure Ruthven seemingly fatally. This is where Aubrey makes a huge mistake, swearing an oath to Lord Ruthven as he lay dying that he is not to talk about Lord Ruthven for just over a year, which in itself I found odd when reading the story, but Aubrey agreed. I guess I can't be too hard on him for respecting the wishes of what he thought was a dying man, especially one I suppose he felt indebted to after being nursed back to health, but it's still at least somewhat odd all the same. If that wasn't eerie enough, Ruthven begins laughing as he dies. The damage is done. On the body, he finds the sheath matching the dagger found by the body of Ianthe. So now we know for a fact that this dagger was deliberately left as a sign meant to taunt Aubrey. There is no practical use for it being there. This guy simply just takes great pleasure in making his victims miserable or anxious, and he specifically has it out for Aubrey. Aubrey's travels have come to a close, and he returns back to London, and to his surprise, and maybe not exactly to ours, he finds Lord Ruthven there alive. Here's the problem. The oath that Aubrey took with the vampire seems to physically prevent him from warning anybody about Lord Ruthven. Even worse, Ruthven gets engaged to Aubrey's sister, and in a very clearly deliberate, cruel fashion, the wedding is scheduled for the exact day that Aubrey's oath expires. Aubrey is absolutely stuck now. He can't stop or postpone the wedding. He's only left to watch as his sister, blissfully unaware, marches towards the day of her own death. The sheer amount of stress piled upon Aubrey is now also slowly killing him, growing weaker and weaker until he even has a stroke. Even in this weaker state, however, upon the day that these two are to be wed, Aubrey does everything in his power to warn people of Ruthven, but he doesn't make it in time before his sister is ultimately found dead, with Ruthven nowhere to be found. This man actively came for Aubrey's loved ones, taking pleasure in repeatedly adding to his grief, taunting him all the way, from planting small hints to showing his true full nature around the end. To me, this is an absolutely evil vampire. He's certainly not likable at all, but he has it all for a villain role. He's cunning, he's manipulative, and above all else, he's vindictive. To me, while it was somewhat questionable that Aubrey did oblige certain requests that Lord Ruthven made, there was still a sound strategy here that I could reasonably believe. This guy is very much a threat. I thought he was well written, and so I believe that he belongs in the S tier along with the likes of Carmilla in the original Dracula. These are the kind of vampires that I am absolutely here for. So now we've covered a good amount of our base vampire mythology. I'm well aware that there's more, however. The aforementioned Dracula movie starring Christopher Lee actually has several more sequels that I have yet to watch, but fully plan to. Carmilla has several adaptations of her own that I also intend on checking out in the future, and overall, there's still a lot to cover. But I wanted to cover these major three before I continue with your more modern vampire approaches in media. So now, with that established, we'll move on to more of those. We've talked about some of your most prominent titles that have strongly influenced the vampire genre, all of which being older books and films so far, but there is one modern instance of a piece of media that has influenced the vampire genre for better or for worse. I think you know what I'm about to mention here, and I do so very reluctantly. The 2008 film Twilight. Surprisingly, a very successful title at the time, as we all know. Twilight taps into that same romantic aspect of vampires that we talked about earlier in the video. Let's get to the point. For me, I don't mind people exploring that aspect at all. It's one of the core components in most, if not all, older vampire works. Romance is always explored to at least some degree, whether it be within your main cast or with your vampires themselves. This particular film focuses on the latter. I'm going to be honest. There were 2 movies so far that I just couldn't sit through all the way when researching this topic, and this is definitely one of them. I made it about halfway through and then immediately had enough. If you personally enjoyed the film, because I'm well aware this had some audience that liked it, good for you, honestly, to each his own. To me, there's a lot I didn't like. Bella and Edward just don't even really seem to ever remotely function as a couple, for starters. It felt to me like they bonded for about 5 minutes at most, and then the rest was just bickering in some way, shape, or form. It never really felt like there was exactly any common ground established between the two for their relationship to make any sense. It felt like these two genuinely just hated each other. To the movie's credit, it gave a reason, but to me, it just wasn't really a convincing one. Apparently, Edward can read thoughts, and it annoys him hearing what everybody is thinking all the time. But Bella is somehow different, with him stating that he hears nothing from Bella. It's delivered almost in an insulting way, too. Like, she just doesn't think, although I know, of course, that's not what they meant when writing this dialogue. My problem is more so, how is this alone grounds for dating someone, especially with a couple where saving the other's life turns into a heavy disagreement? It doesn't really look good, even when they do somewhat manage to get along, because whenever Bella brings up a genuine concern with this guy, he doesn't really even give a proper response. He just starts straight up mewing. I really hate to have most of my criticism be mostly negative about any piece of media, but I still have more things that I took some issue with, so I guess I'll go through them as quickly and concisely as possible. To me, it didn't handle its usage of vampire mythos very well. We'll do the very obvious and glaring one that everyone talks about first. Sunlight doesn't even harm this guy. He just glitters in the sun. This is very counterintuitive to me. The appeal of the vampire is that they're not like humans. They see things differently. They live differently. It gives us a completely different perspective, and their weaknesses, their struggles, are often used to demonstrate meaningful, genuinely interesting themes. A great deal of potential is missed here with this choice alone. These are the creatures of the night. They live in the night. They are forced to live in solitude due to it, never able to see the sun ever again. Other than their diet, which can honestly be hidden very well on its own anyways, we've seen it in other stories, this is what separates them from the world of humans. The weight of solitude that spawned from this alone would be a great driving force for a vampire eventually seeking out some sort of romantic partner, especially with someone who can still experience the joy of the sun, someone who can remind them of what it's like since they can't do it themselves anymore. The human could make the vampire feel more human again in that way, something like that. But all of that potential is just stripped away with this choice, and it makes everything so low stakes. Instead of, this is the skin of a killer, while he's simply glittering in the sunlight, it would be, we don't even live in the same world. And that's not the only thing that makes this so low stakes. While a vampire reading minds isn't technically unheard of, I mean, we saw this in Dracula. Telepathically reading someone's thoughts had extreme limits. Count Dracula had to bite Mina and then also have her drink his blood for this to happen. It's an insane, advantageous ability to have, and it's one of the many things that make this character seem unjustified in his angst, the only reasonable source of which being that he must feed on the living, which he only limits to animals anyhow. All of these things just make him more so just a human with superpowers. There's no real struggle. There's no different lifestyle that makes him appealing. That's what this is. It's a sad, pale man with superpowers. I could go on and on about how I dislike the movie in and of itself, how it drags, how there's a blue filter slapped in scenes where there really just shouldn't be. Even the happier ones. But we're here to judge Edward, and there's one thing I like about Twilight in and of itself is the base concept is fine. A vampire romance set in modern times could really make for a really interesting and great plot if done right, but to me, this movie stripped all of the romantic appeal of the vampire away, and it just falls flat. So unfortunately, Twilight the movie is going at the bottom of the list. I know that there are more movies, and I know that there are plenty of books in the Twilight series. Honestly, I had no desire to check any of them out, but if you guys really want to put me through it, maybe eventually I'll get to the rest of it. Maybe I just need to give everything a fair shake, but my gut says that it's probably just not for me. Now, on to our final film in this video, and yes, don't worry, I have plenty more vampire media that I watched that I will get to in later videos. I wanted to look at a movie that came out directly a year after Twilight, a film that actually does utilize a vampire's necessary avoidance of the sun. Daybreakers is a vampire movie that came out in 2009. It centers around a society where vampires make up most of your general population and are no longer hidden. On the contrary, it's the humans hiding this time. The vampires needing a stable food supply for their society society literally have people farms, and it's unpleasant as you would imagine. I can't really even show you the footage of these things on YouTube either. Just know that it's about as disturbing as the concept sounds. They use machines to quite literally drain blood out of people's unconscious bodies. You can also definitely tell that this movie was made in the year after 2008 because it establishes the economic consequences of this. Vampire society hits a massive hurdle where new vampires just keep being made, but they simply cannot produce enough human blood with these farms to feed them all, and they're desperate for solutions. This is especially since if they don't drink enough blood and basically starve, vampires turn into these less humanoid, mindless, hungry creatures that will eat just about anything, including other vampires. The protagonist of this film, hematologist Edward, yes, his name is also Edward Dalton, works closely around these human farms, trying to find an adequate substitute for human blood. Because he's familiar with these farms and quite literally how inhumane they are, he refuses to drink human blood, instead drinking the blood of animals, which he gets ridiculed for. In short, though, Edward saves a group of humans, leading him to be ousted from vampire society, having to hide among these humans instead. He begins working with these humans to find a cure for vampirism, aiming to turn the vampire population back to normal. Big spoiler, they eventually do, and the solution is honestly pretty funny. Apparently, you have to bake a vampire just right, exposing them to sunlight just enough to where they don't die, but change back and I guess gain their immortality back. Basically, re-exposing them to sunlight just enough. Edward, with this exact method, is successfully changed back into a human. Once again, though, the upper class of vampire society does not like this very much. This was an industry that made huge profits after all. Obviously, they have no intention of letting that go, and unlike Edward, they don't have any qualms using humans in these farms still. And that's where your main dilemma for the characters to sort out comes from. I could go on and on about this movie, but the short conclusion I have is that it made for a very interesting watch. In my opinion, a lot of these ideas are very cool. It's just a little funny in some parts, given that it's a 2009 movie with goofy effects and whatnot. Its visuals aren't really the greatest, including some of the set design, but I like its premise. It's reflective of the time period that it was made in. Unfortunately, so was its overall reception, with Twilight still leaving a bad taste in a lot of viewers' mouths. With this movie, I would have to rate the vampire population overall, based on how it's organized and how well thought out it is. It's definitely questionable to a degree. The idea of cooking a vampire to the right temperature to cure them, but I love the ways that this movie imagines in depth how a society would be if vampires actually won for once, down to the small details. It still also keeps the overall symbolism you would find in a lot of vampire stories, telling of nobility versus common folk, just in a modern fashion this time. Overall, I give the execution of the vampires themselves an A ranking. It left some questions, but honestly, I liked it. The movie itself, not absolute cinema, but I enjoyed it, honestly. So, in this video, I established a lot of the core source material for vampire media and major influences. In the next video, it will be a lot more of your modern stuff, but I also intend to include things like vampirism and animals and other things of that nature. I want to do my best to tackle everything I know about vampires in this series, all the media that I've experienced myself. But I'm also open to suggestions for other material that I can look into, whether it be from games, music, books, what have you. I invite you to leave any suggestions for vampire media so that I can check it out down in the comments below. I'd also like to hear your overall thoughts on what I did talk about, if you agreed with what I said or even disagreed. I'd love to hear some more productive discussion on this topic, since it's definitely one that I am a huge, longtime fan of. And as always, I'd like to thank you for watching. You can expect more of this type of content in the future, since I honestly really enjoyed not only the process of making this video and sharing my interests with you all, but even the research process for this was fun. Except for when I had to watch Twilight. And with that, that's the end of the video. I am Strix Prime, and I am heading back to my coffin.